Hi, everybody, and welcome back to A Foggy Day on Olympus. And today we've decided to just jump right into what we're very excited about as our new series. And before we begin, I'll just start with my name is Kawal Campo. And of course, today's new series is on that effervescent buzzword fundamentalism. And so this is, like we said, the first episode, and the title of it is What is Fundamentalism?
Right. And my name is Mike Pierce. This is a follow on to the series that we just finished about the Roman Catholic Church. So now we're going to be giving fundamentalism and, by extension, evangelicalism more generally the same kind of treatment. How on earth did it grapple with and engage with the modern world, and what kind of turnings were made as a result of that grappling? Yes.
Right. Yeah, so to begin, I think I'm going to need you to answer the question, what actually is fundamentalism?
Okay, well, I'm going to try and restrain myself here, and if I fail, I know that you will help me from going off on a rant. I'm going to start off not by defining it positively. We'll do that later on. We'll do that through the course of this episode. But at least negatively, what fundamentalism is not. Fundamentalism is one of these words, rather like fascism and socialism, and there's probably a couple of others, that simply become boo words and people wave them around to show how awful those they dislike are. Right. And of course, it makes public discussion actually impossible. It's not merely an objectionable way of behaving, I'd say. It's actually dangerous because if we can't settle on sensible and agreed definitions of important terms, in discussing with one another and disagreeing with one another, then that brings recourse to force and even violence that much closer. So it's important that we name things for what they are and not go for category stretch constantly or category drag in some respect that might suit whoever's talking. So what I want to say is fundamentalism is not simply some body of people or some group who are more ultra religious or rigid in their views than the person speaking happens to like. And certainly it doesn't apply to anything outside of a certain kind of Christianity. I would go so far as to say, talk of Muslim fundamentalism is equally nonsensical and actually dangerous and increases misunderstanding, not understanding. And within Christianity, it refers to a certain kind of evangelical Protestantism. So that's the kind of the negative side of it. And more positively, we'll lay out what some, not most of that is during the course of this episode. Yes.
Well, do you feel better now?
Yeah. I feel like I've got that off my chest.
That's what we really
Yeah.
want, is for you to be feeling better here.
Yeah. Never mind the audience. This is therapy for me. Yes. Okay. Well, as so often, let's start off by recommending a really good book. And this one, you can see from the date, it's 45 years old now. And he said 44 there, but we're in 2025 now, aren't we? 45 years old and still absolutely crucial book. George Marsden, his book on fundamentalism made him the doyen of American church historians and really brought the topic to serious scholarly attention. So he's not speaking uh, simply on its behalf. He's an evangelical, but not a fundamentalist himself. And neither is he lambasting it or deconstructing it from some kind of secularist or other outsider perspective. He's trying to do a serious historical analysis, which, of course, in our own lightweight terms is what we're trying to do with everything we touch on here. So I would say that for anybody wanting to investigate that, that book, which is still in print, has to be the starting point. Yes, we'll start off then with a little quotation from him. It's from the first 2 or 3 pages of his book. You'll see from the dots we've jumped around a little here to get the most important points. Um, and he starts off giving us a prehistory of fundamentalism because fundamentalism, strictly speaking, doesn't properly exist until we get a few years into the 20th century. So he's looking at the background. American evangelicalism at the zenith of its influence, but about to slide. In 1870, almost all American Protestants thought of America as a Christian nation. Viewed from their dominant perspective, the 19th century had been marked by successive advances of evangelicalism, the American nation, and hence the kingdom of God.
Now, many people watching this might actually be evangelicals, but for those who aren't or who aren't sure, how do we define evangelicalism?
Okay, well, I'm going to fall back on David Bebbington's classic definition from his 1989 book, Evangelicalism in Modern Britain. And he defined it by 4 characteristics, which have been quoted thousands and thousands of times since, because evangelicalism, perhaps up to that point, was something where if you'd asked scholars, they would have said, well, it's hard to tie down, but we know it when we see it. And then he came up with his 4 characteristics, and everybody leapt on and said, this is it. This is how we define it. Okay, so it is biblicism, that the Bible as authority trumps every other source of religious authority. You might or might not give some religious authority to the institutional church or tradition or reason or spirit inspiration. You might or might not, any of those things, but all of them are trumped by biblical authority. So biblicism. Secondly, conversionism. A person needs to undergo a religious conversion that marks the difference between not being a Christian and being a Christian. Activism. Evangelicals are busy people. They're always doing things, organizing, of course, incessant meetings and missions, but doing good works, charity, social improvement, education, starting foundations, this kind of thing. And finally, crucicentrism, the centrality of the cross. As Bebbington pointed out, we preach Christ crucified, Paul's famous expression. Might have been coined just for the evangelicals, right? That finally all preaching and all theology and all devotional life come back to the centrality of the cross. And although these things have seldom been absent through Christian history, that kind of combination first comes together in the late 1730s with what we call on both sides of the Atlantic the Great Awakening. And so basically creates modern evangelicalism as we understand it now. And so, although Marsden is writing a few years before Bebbington's famous book, nevertheless, that's the kind of thing that he's taken for granted when he uses this expression.
Okay, but how on earth is all that bound up with American religious nationalism? And how could America be a Christian nation when it didn't have a national church?
Well, those are very good questions, and they generally exercise the mind of foreigners, of non Americans, sometimes maybe too much, and Americans not nearly enough.
Right.
Right? So, yes, that's important to mention. I mean, of course, before the revolution, the American Revolution of the 1770s, early 1780s, the various British colonies did have official churches. It varied from colony to colony, most famously, of course, Congregationalism in New England. But even those were not at all tightly enforced. And although vestiges of those privileges remained, most notably again in New England, for a few decades after independence, they just kind of faded away because everywhere that was America and the lands that were later on becoming America were just religiously way too pluralist to entertain any such idea. But because quite a lot of people were religious dissenters in their own countries before coming to America, that made them in many ways largely driven by religion, and the differing forms and the constantly mutating shape of evangelicalism, a procedure that's continued right down to the present day, made evangelicalism central to American life and somehow identified with it. So, however paradoxical it may be, particularly when one remembers that a lot of the most influential and fast-growing churches were either Baptist or at least Baptistic. That is, churches whose whole central shtick is that people are called out of the world to follow Christ. There can't be such a thing as a Christian nation. So, however paradoxical that may be, that was becoming deeply entrenched during those first 100 years of the Republic. Yeah. Okay. Well, so for many Northerners, Marsden explains that the victory in the Civil War of the early 1860s confirmed, as one Presbyterian observer put it, that we as individuals and as a nation are identified with that kingdom of God among men. Now, this is the sort of really quite dangerous religious nationalism that is still present in America, identifying themselves virtually with the Old Testament people of God in Israel, which is something that we touched on, by the way, in the first episode of our first series on the history of Jews and Israel, if anybody wants to go back and have a look at that. Okay, the examples set by revivalist forebears who had met the challenges of Enlightenment infidelity, that is, unbelief, with spirituality and intellect, gave confidence for the new era. Now, what Marsden's referring to there is the range of really quite intellectually formidable leaders who have been influential in American evangelicalism and indeed in American life as a whole up to that point in time. So we could look right back to, say, someone like Jonathan Edwards in the 18th century, who wasn't merely a great theologian. I mean, I'm not mad about his theology, but that's my own problem. He was a great theologian, but he was also an important philosopher and thinker in a number of other areas. Perhaps one of the most important thrown up in America before the Revolution. But then even people we often think of as more populist revivalists, like Charles Grandison Finney in the early 19th century, was no intellectual slouch either. And there were a number of people in that kind of mould, even though alongside it there were a number of decidedly unintellectual, even anti-intellectual tub thumpers, right, in various parts of evangelicalism. So Marsden there is paying tribute to the former. The Reverend Theodore Dwight Woolsey, we've got his dates here, retired president of Yale, opined that, quote, the vast majority of the people believe in Christianity and the gospel. The Christian influences are universal, that our civilization and intellectual culture are built on that foundation and furnish the best hope for spreading and carrying down to our posterity our faith and our morality.
Was Woolsey right about this? I mean, maybe not about his optimism for the future, but about the situation in 1870?
Yeah, he was right about the situation in 1870, that things really did look that way. Now, this is not to say that everybody in the United States at that point was a Christian, and certainly not to say that they were an evangelical. But those people, similar in Britain at the same time, actually, which was about to decline even more precipitately than America, that they kind of made themselves accepted as the majority. That's that expression I'm using there is a sort of semi-quote from John Stuart Mill, who didn't like this situation. But in both countries, evangelical kind of set the tone and dominated the culture, such that people that weren't like that felt that they should act in ways that seemed as if they were. That doesn't mean spouting religious platitudes all the time, but conform themselves, say, to evangelical social expectations and so on. Yes, but again, his optimism is profoundly misplaced, as Marsden's about to point out. The old order, he says, of American Protestantism was based on the interrelationship of faith, science, Bible, morality, and civilization. And it was about to crumble.
Nice little foreshadowing there.
Yes, he's setting the tone there because what will become fundamentalism a generation further up the road is, in so many respects, a reaction against the sort of modernization that undoes this cozy situation in, say, 1870. Now we should probably explain ourselves here because this series is focusing almost entirely on the US, and there are a number of reasons for that. Because the topic is otherwise vast, absolutely vast, particularly because there are so many different evangelical and later fundamentalist groups, all with their own distinctive histories. And as always with these podcasts, we're generalizing to give people the overall flavor of what was happening. But also because fundamentalism emerged primarily, not exclusively, but primarily under specifically US conditions, particularly, for example, the fact that there had been this evangelical informal cultural hegemony, and also that there were so many different groups. Thirdly, because most, though not all, of fundamentalism's characteristics came from America. And finally, because fundamentalism in other countries was essentially shaped by US influences and sometimes adapted them, sometimes hardly adapted them at all, which is why in a number of countries they were looked at askance as being a sort of a foreign, an American import.
Right. Is this why quite a few American missionaries have confused their version of the faith with American values and practices?
And famously, yes, this is so. The only thing that can be said in their favour on this point is that they weren't breaking any records, that a number of missionaries have been guilty of precisely this. Right, so one thinks, again, not always, but far too often, of a number of British missionaries operating in the British Empire, or say French Catholics in perhaps most famously Vietnam, Southeast Asia, generally missionaries, and so on. Yes, that is very much the case, and sometimes is still a problem, but that is largely rooted in the factors that we've just mentioned here. Yes, yes. Okay, well, just a bit of a reprise here. What was about to hit like a collective tidal wave, this kind of situation that Marsden has just been describing for us in 1870s? We'll give a brief little list, but we're not going to say much about them here. Darwinian evolution, about which much more in the next episode that we'll be producing. Biblical criticism, the socialist theories of Karl Marx, the effects of urbanization and growing consumerism.
Yeah, and these are all things that our viewers can learn much more about from our whole series on secularization, which we called, with our habit of running right along the edge of blasphemy, fighting free of God.
Yes, that's right. That's about, I don't know, 3 series back or something like that. And all of those are dealt with. Most of them are given an entire episode each so that people who miss them can catch up on what we're talking about there and why they had the sort of effects of secularization that they did. And maybe a generation later than in Britain, they hit the United States like a tidal wave in the late 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries. Yes. So there are two main ways that evangelicals could respond to these modernist challenges. The first we might call accommodation, just go with the flow a little bit, try and meet these criticisms and new changes halfway, maybe liberalize doctrine a bit to meet some of these new ideas, and also re emphasize the evangelical tradition of social action. Now, this is forgotten now, not just in America, but some other countries too. In the 19th century, evangelicals were the busy people. They were the ones out running the soup kitchens and the unemployment bureau before there were any bureau, and helping the poor and visiting, expectant mothers or mothers who just delivered, and providing schooling and all this kind of stuff. So people who were becoming more liberal wanted to re-emphasize that tradition to make themselves feel better for the fact that they were capitulating on rather a lot of doctrinal fronts. Okay. And the alternative is retrenchment, restate doctrine, preferably in hard and harsh terms, rather like the Catholic Church had done in the face of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. Restate, toughen up, make more categorical than before. Embrace what they called the Advent hope.
Now, the Advent hope being, I'm assuming it doesn't have anything to do with Christmas.
No, it doesn't. It was their jargon for the then still fairly novel idea of what we call dispensationalism, of which a bit more in a moment, but a new form of eschatology, the immediate effect of which was to say, well, Jesus might be returning at any moment and is going to take us out of this horrible mess. So we don't have to worry about it. What we have to do is to rush around and see people saved from the burning before that comes. So, yes, embracing the Advent hope and abandoning this really crucial part of evangelicalism in the 19th century, pulling away from political, social, and cultural engagement as worldly. And we see this as early as that otherwise totally admirable evangelist D.L. Moody, who starts to make this move. Because American evangelicals realize that they are starting to lose the culture. And so there's really not a lot to be gained by trying to do all of the things that they have been doing up to this point. It's more important to see people saved. So the focus is very much on narrow focus evangelism, saving souls.
Now, these are two very opposite approaches. Was there no middle of the road option?
Well, logically, there should have been,
Right.
but that's actually very hard to do. You tend to get eaten up by one or the other. Now, if anybody doubts that and is sort of tut-tutting to themselves and saying, well, couldn't these people have found some kind of balance? Well, ideally, yes. And were it to be had very easily, that's certainly what I would have gone for, but we're all very good at second-guessing our ancestors. They acted as they did because the pressures on them were what they were. Now, as I say, if anybody doubts that, and here's one of my big ideas coming up, let's consider our present situation for evangelicals. I want to suggest that we are now in the middle of the same kind of parting of the ways in respect of postmodernity that these people were in the early 20th century in respect of the agenda thrown up by modernity. There are a whole load of pressures coming on evangelicals in respect of ideas about truth, about family and sexuality, about identity politics, about gender identity, and so on. And the pressures are really very considerable. And the same kind of choices are being made. Now, let's move on to our next slide here, which looks at the pluses and minuses of the two strategies. Now, this slide is talking specifically about the emergence of fundamentalism in the early 20th century, but maybe mentally you could make the kind of transfer to the current situation in respect of postmodernity while we're looking at it. So, what are the pluses and minuses of the two strategies? What about accommodation? Well, the advantage is that you stay up to date with the culture. You placate some critics without and doubters within. The disadvantage is that many will not be placated for very long as discussion moves on, and doctrinal erosion becomes ever greater.
So we're saying that the liberalizers become more and more liberal over time.
Yes, that's what happens. That's what happens. They start off making certain concessions and it becomes like a snowball effect. I'm not wanting to give credence to the sometimes bogus arguments on the fundamentalist side that they constantly resorted to slippery slope arguments, and their equivalents today do the same. And those are fallacious. But nevertheless, there is some truth in the point that once you start moving in this direction, you tend to keep on doing so, yes. Well, what about the retrenchers? Well, the advantage is you are staying faithful to evangelical orthodoxy. The disadvantage is you become increasingly alien to the culture you're living in and so increasingly incredible to ordinary people.
Yeah, I think it's easy to see how these are the options of the church in the present day.
Yes, that's what's going on now in respect of a whole load of different issues. Yes, that's right. Okay, well, we're going to dive out here for a moment for an important digression, and that is the topic of dispensationalism. We already referred to it.
Yeah, this topic does have a habit of continually coming up, doesn't it?
Yes, yes, it does, because it is so influential on how so many people think. Now, we're going to cover in lightning fast fashion here some ground we covered already many, many episodes ago, because I'm worried that if we simply refer people to that other episode, they might not do it. But they need to know this to understand what we're talking about here. So let's just cover it again very quickly. Dispensationalism, long word, is a form of eschatology, another long word, thinking about the end times and the return of Jesus. It's a form of theology about that subject that hadn't existed until 1830. That's going to upset some people to think that, because if you are a dispensationalist, you want to think it goes all the way back to the Bible, you know. Well, okay, but if so, nobody had understood the truth for the first 1800 years. Good luck with that. Okay, this idea is that there are 7 dispensations, different ways that God deals with humanity, spelled out in the Bible. That each dispensation ends with failure on man's part, which sounds like a very good evangelical ethos, because one thing they have in common is the sound insight that we're all extremely sinful, which is certainly true. But the logic of that is that the church will be in decline before the return of Christ. Okay. Then the church is not predicted in the Old Testament, remarkably. All prophecy is still to be fulfilled, which is called futurism, and is to be understood, this is a very important point, is to be understood literally. Now, the dispensationalists are famous amongst many other things for their attempt to understand even a lot of the book of Revelation literally, which I think is an extremely unwise task to set oneself, to say the very least. There's certainly one, at least one thing in there which is understood literally, which is that Jesus is coming back, right? But mostly it is transparently, obviously picture language. Then, fourthly, that different verses of scripture are directed to different people. So, dispensationalists claim to be able to dissect the speeches of Jesus and say, oh, this sentence is aimed at the Jews and this is aimed at the Gentiles. They are also premillennialists. Now, to be absolutely fair here, and I have to be because I'm a premillennialist, the early church was premillennialist, right? Demonstrably so, right? But their form of premillennialism is hyper. It's very extreme. This is, Jesus could come back next Tuesday type of stuff, which leads straight into the idea of any minute rapture. The saints who are alive on the earth at this time are going to be snatched up to meet Jesus in the air. And finally, that Israel will be given the Davidic kingdom on earth at the millennium. There's so much that could be said about each of those, and we're not going to say any of it. Just something we need to know. Why are we mentioning this at all? Because it's a theology of pessimism about this world. Just as the dominant eschatology that preceded it in the 19th century, post-millennialism, had been hyper-optimistic. The world's getting better and better, which is what secular people believed as well. But in a Christian sense, it can become more and more Christian. That had been the dominant eschatology amongst evangelicals up to this point. Post-millennialists, there are not many of them these days, but if there's any tuning in, I'm about to upset you. That doesn't go back any further than the early 17th century and the English Puritan Thomas Brightman, right? That doesn't exist either until 1610, 1617, something like that. So this is the opposite extreme. It's hyper-pessimism. The world's getting worse and worse. which accords with what we see happening around us, and the church is getting worse and worse, which accords with what we're seeing around us, and Jesus is coming back to rescue us from this horrible mess at any moment. That's simplification, although everything we're doing in these series is simplification, but that does about sum it up. And it was taking over. And it forms a crucial part of what will be fundamentalism. Not all fundamentalists would be dispensationalists, but all dispensationalists would be fundamentalists, aided by their instinct towards literalism. You know, if you can be literalist about the book of Revelation, you can be literalist about anything.
Right. Yeah, there's some things in Revelation that I definitely don't want to believe are real.
Right. Well, they might be real, but they're not literal. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Well, let's now turn to this man, C.I. Scofield. He's not the founder of dispensationalism. That was J.N. Darby back in 1830. But he is a very, very influential developer of it for reasons we shall see in a few moments. He was born in Michigan, but brought up in Tennessee, served in the Confederate Army before deserting behind Union lines. After the war, he got married, he undertook legal training, he backed a Republican for governor of Kansas and was rewarded by being made U.S. District Attorney for Kansas, aged just 29. So he's coming up in the world quite fast. He soon had to resign amidst corruption allegations. He became a heavy drinker. He abandoned his wife and daughters, and he was converted in the late 1870s. And he later remarried in 1883 and was ordained a Congregationalist minister the same year. Now, he's most influential because of his notes on the Bible, which we'll come to in a moment. So here's Scofield discussing the topic of dispensationalism in his book, Prophecy Made Plain. Whoever reads the scriptures with any consecutiveness or attention cannot fail to perceive that in them may be traced a gradual unfolding of divine truth and purpose. When this is understood, then it begins to be seen that there's a beautiful system in this gradualness of unfolding.
Now, systems are a modernist imposition upon the Bible, which is a very unsystematic book.
Yes, yes. Modernist Christians have had the itch to reduce the Bible, which is, insofar as its theology is dynamic theology, to system, because that's how modernist Westerners think. This is why many people refer to Calvin as the first modern man. He's living in the early modern period, of course, in developing his system. But others have had the same sort of itch, and that's what Scofield and the dispensationalists are trying to do here, yes. The past is seen to fall into periods marked off by distinct limits. Thus, it comes to be understood that there's a doctrine of the ages or dispensations in the Bible. The clear perception of this doctrine of the ages marks a most important step in the progress of the student of the divine oracles. In other words, if you're like me and you're a really advanced student of the Bible, then you will agree with this doctrine. That's really what he's saying. Okay, it has the same relationship to the right understanding of the scriptures that correct outline work has to map making. Every schoolboy knows that when the outline is right, the details, rivers, mountains, cities, come easily into their right relative positions. Just so it is with the Bible. For lack of clearness at the point of the dispensational divisions, the majestic and beautiful synthesis of truth is inevitably lost. For this unfolding of truth and purpose by distinct stages and according to a necessary order of progress. Okay. That's an 18th century Enlightenment idea for you, is one of the seals of God upon the whole book, marking it as its own. As I say that, I'm just remembering one of George Marsden's key points. He constantly points out that dispensationalists argued that the evidence of this system within Scripture was one of the strongest evidences for its truth, that it was a divine book, because this system was to be found within it.
But again, the dispensational divisions are not mentioned in the Bible itself. They're a category being imposed on the text.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Well, Schofield's most influential work by far, is the Schofield Reference Bible. And this is an edition of the King James Bible, the authorized version, which most people used overwhelmingly in America, although newer translations were appearing. And in this Bible, published in 1909, he gives his notes on verses in the margins, pushing the reader to a dispensationalist view. So we've got a picture of a page from a Schofield Reference Bible, and in the middle column there are cross references of one Bible verse directing you to another to which it refers. Now, in some ways, that's perfectly fair enough. So, for example, the New Testament is constantly quoting the Old Testament. And so it would be good practice in many editions of the Bible simply to have a little note there saying, what's being quoted here is blah, 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 right? But you could also use it to tie it up with other verses that indicate the kind of doctrinal picture you want the reader to absorb. And the notes that he makes at the bottom are overwhelmingly doing that, pushing you to a dispensationalist view. Now, it's sold by the millions and became virtually the standard edition of the Bible for several generations of evangelicals. Now, when you and I talked about this a day or two ago, I asked you if your parents were familiar with it. And they said that they didn't actually have such an edition, did they? But
Yeah,
what did they say?
they'd only heard of it, and all they knew was that it was very, very old.
Well, it doesn't go back any further than 1909. Okay. But for loads of people, they were brought up with this. Now, I remember back in, let's get this right now, 1977, and I went to a Bible week where that astonishing preacher Ern Baxter was speaking. I would say, even after all these years, the best preacher I've ever heard by miles and miles, even though I now realize that some of the stuff he was saying was not quite right. Okay, but neophyte though I was at that stage, I still got the joke when he made a point about this. He referred to something in the notes of the Schofield Reference Bible, and then gives a dramatic pause and says to the assembled, I don't know, there were 5,000 of us there or something like that, the assembled throng, which is not part of the inspired text, by the way. And even at that stage, I fell about laughing along with everybody else because it was a darn good joke. Because all the other people around me, most of whom will have been brought up in this kind of environment, which I had not been, that was what they had at least implicitly understood, that somehow the notes shared in the divine inspiration of the actual text. And that just underscores how incredibly influential this was. All right, so we need to understand that. That's a fast rising force in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and comes to dominate fundamentalism, even though not all fundamentalists take that view. Now, a measure of this is that even in very recent years, when I was teaching at Houghton College, and you were there, um, I'd refer to various dispensationalist tenets of faith and say, how many of you are familiar with this from your home churches? And every single time, almost all the students would say, well, that's what my church teaches. Or even, well, that's what the Bible teaches.
Yeah,
Right? So, yeah, there you go. There you go.
yeah.
All right, let's get down to the business end of this episode. The name fundamentalism comes from a very, very important series of essays, 90 essays by 64 authors, published during 1910 to 1915 in 12 volumes by the Bible Institute of Los Angeles.
So, Bible Institute of Los Angeles. This is Biola University today, isn't it?
Now it is, yeah, that's it. That's where it comes from. Bible Institute of Los Angeles, Biola, right? And these books were funded by wealthy Christian businessmen and distributed free. 250,000 sets were produced, and no advanced training in mathematics is necessary to work out that that comes to 3 million volumes, and given out free to Christian workers of all kinds. And they set out the fundamentals resisting the modernist ideas of all sorts. And so here's a partial answer to our question, what is fundamentalism? Certainly for the first decade or so, a fundamentalist was someone who agreed with what was taught in the fundamentals. Now, the editors deliberately spread their net as widely, denomination wise, as possible to take authors from the austere patrician religion end of the spectrum right the way through to the tub thumpers. This is what all are agreed upon. So there are no disputes between, I don't know, Calvinists and Arminians, or over the nature of baptism, or about entire sanctification. Nothing like that, right? The fundamentals, the things that all evangelical Protestants are agreed upon or should be. Now, Reuben Torrey was one of the three editors, a very influential character. He had been sidekick is a rude way of putting it, but an important assistant to the great evangelist D.L. Moody, wonderful man. So Reuben Torrey, kind of successor figure in some ways to him, but they spread their net widely, as I said. So one of the contributors is B.B. Warfield, right? There's the representative of highbrow patrician religion Presbyterianism. He'd been a professor and accepted the theory of evolution, but he did not accept the conclusions of radical biblical criticism. He remains a kind of hero figure for very hard-boiled Reformed types generally, and Presbyterians specifically today, actually. And he contributed an article on the deity of Christ to the fundamentals.
It looks like having a glorious mustache was part of the requirements for being involved.
Yeah, I think it was part of the requirement for being a late Victorian. Which I'm following in their train, as you notice.
Yes.
Yeah,
Well, I mean,
I'm sure your comment there was far from entirely accidental. Thank you so much. Okay, so what was the fundamentals trying to achieve? Well, two main things. Firstly, to create a rallying point for Orthodox evangelicals of all denominations and stripes, especially by emphasizing biblical inspiration and authority.
now this is kind of impressive to create this much unity between the denominations.
Yes, it was, because until this point, loads of these people would have had little or nothing to do with one another, right? Someone like Warfield would have looked at some of the people at the sweatier tin tabernacle end of evangelicalism and have been appalled, and they would have looked at him perhaps and thought, what universe is he living in? Yeah, yeah. So no small achievement. Yes. But the second thing they're trying to do is to delineate orthodoxy against what it was not by attacking what they called Romanism.
Now, this is their rather hostile term for Roman Catholicism, right?
Right,
As we saw in the final episode of our last series, the hostility between Catholics and evangelicals was not really undone until the 1960s and 1970s.
right. And that was the product of, well, three things really. Vatican II, on the evangelical side of the equation, the rise of the charismatic movement. And we saw in the last episode of the last series how you very quickly get a Catholic charismatic movement. So that's kissing and making up for sure. But also the first stirrings of what would later on become the culture wars, in which Catholics and evangelicals found themselves on the same side. And that's gone so far now that in many, many circles, in America at least, not necessarily everywhere else, although relations have improved almost everywhere, but in America particularly, evangelicals and Catholics have been living in one another's pockets for a generation now. So, yes, this was not that day, for sure. You're still getting all the hostile rhetoric, both sides. Well, also batting off higher criticism and liberal theology or modernism.
higher criticism. This is something that we dealt with in episode 5 of our series on fighting free of God.
Yes, yes. Also, socialism, and then Christian Science, Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, and spiritualism.
And why are these sects being mentioned here?
Well, because they'd all really become influential in the later part of the 19th century, especially in America. In fact, one, two, three. The first three of those are all American made. The fourth one might be. I'm just not well enough informed. And the embarrassing thing is that the first three of those are all wild spin offs from biblicist evangelicalism itself. Right? They might have ended up being completely heretical and absorbing, in the case of Christian Science, profoundly alien influences. So they're defining themselves against these heretical groups. Yes. And then finally, of course, evolution, which was not, as we saw a moment ago, a fetish for Warfield, but was for many and will become even more so, as we will see next week. Yeah. Well, we're going to finish here just by looking at a characteristic early fundamentalist leader. He's not the leader of evangelicalism or fundamentalism, there isn't one, but he's characteristic of the general trend and direction that things were moving, and that is Billy Sunday. He was the preeminent American evangelist of the early 20th century.
Yeah, I feel like with a surname like Sunday, he would practically have to go into ministry.
Yeah, well, he was descended from German immigrants whose surname had been Sonntag, so it was simply anglicized to Sunday. That may have embarrassed him because he was loudly in favor of America joining in the First World War on the side of the British and French, which not all Americans were for a long time, but he was. So I dare say his ancestry must have been some kind of embarrassment to him. Well, our picture here shows him at his crusade in Pittsburgh in February 1914, so a little bit before the First World War breaks out. And he certainly goes in for pulpit theatrics. This picture shows him, these are staged for effect, and from these photographs, there's a whole series of them. We can see they were practiced beforehand. They weren't as spontaneous as they were made to appear. So here he is again waving his hand around. And remarkably, for such an anti intellectual, he was a Presbyterian because, well, say what you like about Presbyterians, and I do, they are generally in favor of the solid intellectual effort. But this kind of declamatory style had crept in even there. So at his ordination interview in 1903, he answered questions with, that's too deep for me, and I'll have to pass that up. And I don't know any more about theology than Jack Rabbit knows about ping pong, but I'm on my way to glory. Now this is a guy who had virtually no education, and he'd been a professional baseball player before he converted and turned to ministry. Well, this poster here is Billy Sunday fighting the devil. So again, all the theatrics. He was a self-described rube of the rubes and graduate of the University of Poverty. So he epitomizes this new kind of anti-intellectual style. The anti-intellectualism had been around for a long time. It had been there, but it now comes right into the foreground. And also, it's now metamorphosing into something that lamentably is still with us in many congregations and denominations. And that's the impulse to have a meeting or a service as a kind of public spectacle of entertainment, whether in terms of music or maybe pulpit histrionics and so on. And it seems to me that that is proving profoundly alienating, actually, in postmodern times. It should have done long before, in my not entirely humble opinion. But there we are. He epitomizes it. And here he is with another staged photo, the ultimate Bible thumper. The ultimate Bible thumper.
Yeah, this looks like a man who is always saying the Bible says without actually ever carefully explaining the text.
Yes, yes, that's another besetting sin that's still with a certain kind of preacher today. The Bible says, and maybe, it doesn't. And they just kind of wave it around as a flag rather than actually doing the congregation a favor by getting to grips with the text. Well, we've got a number of fruity quotations from him here, one of which will strike many ears as extremely familiar, but let's just take a quick look at them. So, the reason you don't like the Bible, you old sinner, is because it knows all about you. So, a little aggressive there. The Bible will always be full of things you cannot understand as long as you will not live according to those you can understand, which is actually true. And also putting rather more belligerently the way that one of the early pietist leaders had put the matter a couple of hundred years before, rather more winsomely than Sunday did. Okay, here's the one everybody will recognize. Going to church doesn't make you a Christian any more than going to a garage makes you an automobile. I want to preach the gospel so plainly that men can come from the factories and not have to bring along a dictionary. When the word of God says one thing and scholarship says another, scholarship can go to hell.
Wow.
Yeah, well, there's your anti-intellectual bite for you. And then when the English language gets in my way, I walk all over it. So he was well aware that sometimes even his English wasn't up to snuff. So, and again, it's like Yabu sucks to respectability, to intellectual solidity, or anything like that. A lot of this is, the tub thumpers' self-vindication. And here we have, finally, on this Billy Sunday, messing around even on the steps of the White House. I fear that this kind of silly stuff would be fairly frequent today, probably quite offensive still in, when is this picture from? The 1920s, I guess, when he's doing that, as it should have been. That is not respectful. Although I don't suppose it's an expression of disrespect for the president. It's more like a, hey, look where I am. I think that's, it's like an early form of selfie.
Yeah. If only he'd had one.
Yeah, one shudders to think. Oh dear. I mean, look at his predecessors as the preeminent evangelists. Giles Grandison Finney in the early 19th century. He's not someone you'd want to have a coffee or a beer with, but like Oliver Cromwell, admirable, just from a distance. D.L. Moody, lovely man. Billy Graham, astonishing, wonderful. And then Billy Sunday, you'd want to bury your head in your hands and go, oh my gosh. But there we are. Now, we need to be careful on this subject of reading current culture wars back onto early fundamentalism. So, Billy Sunday's views were simplistic, as you would expect, but fairly typical. So, what did he support? Well, individualism and competition, the American way. Prohibition, which meant, for those who don't remember this from their school history, the campaign to ban the sales of alcohol, which was successful for about a decade, and the experience was so unsuccessful it had to be undone. Women's suffrage, right? Votes for women. There's this tendency to assume that, because fundamentalists are all terrible reactionaries, that therefore they'll have opposed, progressive movement. Not at all. Not at all. He also supported US entry into World War One, which not all fundamentalists did, and certainly, I would say, until the last moment, preponderant opinion inside America was against it. What did he oppose? Monopolistic corporations. So do I. Government regulation. Eugenics. Now, eugenics was popular opinion, growing, particularly held amongst liberals and secularists, because Christians of all kinds tended to be very, very leery of this, and fundamentalists particularly so. This was the idea of selective breeding, that humanity was making progress and should make progress, and what we should do is encourage the right people to breed, and degenerates and the wrong people that we don't approve of not to breed for the future, to improve the human race. Now, of course, eugenics fell into enormous disrepute after the horrifying Nazi experience. And so Christians of this stripe could say, well, we were right all along. Yeah. And it was those liberals and secularists who favoured it, and look how wrong they were. He was opposed to child labour, which was still very prevalent in the US, largely because of he was opposed to child labour, which was still very prevalent in the US, largely because of devolved power to states. So individual states held back on banning this for a long time. And if you look at William Hine, I think it is Hine, he's got loads and loads of photographs of child labour in America in the early 20th century, and it's pitiful. He took the photographs to campaign against it. And Sunday was fairly typical in opposing this as well. Less reputably, he opposed immigration from Catholic and Orthodox Europe because he could see, I suppose, correctly, that that would dilute the Protestant domination of America. Opposed to the teaching of evolution, but of course, also opposed to dancing, card playing, theatres, and novels. And this kind of legalism would, as we will see in the third episode in this series, scar fundamentalism right through much of the 20th century.
Okay, so after all of this, can we have a positive definition of fundamentalism?
Okay, so positively defined as opposed to what fundamentalism isn't. Fundamentalism can be defined as a particularly hard boiled species of Protestant evangelicalism that is insistent on a number of fast becoming out of date cultural mores and understandings and intellectual trend, is not entirely dominated by dispensationalists, but will become so, and has a very strong emphasis upon biblical literalism, partly as a result of that, even where that's not a very wise way, and not even the traditional way of understanding an awful lot of biblical passages. So it's very much marked by that literalism. And as we shall see in the next episode, that becomes particularly acute in respect of the early chapters of Genesis and issues around evolution and so on. I just want to squeeze in at the end here Mike Pierce's big idea, because having wondered for a long time before I really had that much exposure to America and certainly hadn't lived there, having wondered for a long time why Baptistic churches in America, so Baptists, Pentecostals, other people like that, the people who baptize believers don't christen babies, why they of all people should be so insistent on the idea of a Christian America. Surely their ecclesiology, their theology, should tell them that no such thing was possible, that they were being bad Baptists or bad Pentecostals, as well as not very good America with its separation of church and state. And then I read something by a person who shall remain nameless, coming from a very reformed point of view. He was very reformed, but he was not really very smart. And this was written back in the 1990s. I found myself vehemently agreeing with him for one paragraph and then disagreeing for the next. And he was going into bat for, the reformed churches and how this indicated that there should be a strong separation of church and state. And of course, I was thinking, you don't even know the history of the reformers. The Reformed theology tells you there should be a Christian country with a compulsory church, right? And it's the people you don't like who are saying this in America, which is very strange. And it was then that I realised that what has happened in America is extremely unusual. And what had happened was this: that a whole load of different people had gone to early America, still while it was British colonies, right? And there were amongst them Lutherans and Presbyterians and Congregationalists, and in the South, Anglicans, all of whose churches believed in a Christian country, and who ideally would have wanted to be the official church in wherever they were. But they found loads of other people coming in on top of them, like Baptists and Quakers and so on. And it got even worse after the revolution from their point of view, because those groups became the dominant ones. They were the fast expanding ones, right? So these upstart sectarians came to dominate the culture. And so if I'm a Lutheran, or say a Presbyterian or something like that through all of this, or an Episcopalian, which is an Anglican in America, effectively, I'm going to be quietly seething about all this for generations, right? And and so Christian America becomes what we described at the beginning of this episode, an America dominated informally, not by any official church, by all of these kind of groups. And in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the wheels start to come off. So if I am, say, a Lutheran, I'm going to be sitting there going, well, that's okay then. So these people are screaming because they want their Christian America, as defined rather strangely by themselves, back. And the Lutherans and the Presbyterians and the Episcopalians and the others are saying, no, 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 we like the territory we're moving into now. And so they're both trading places on their ecclesiology. And the really bizarre thing is that even to this day, neither realizes that they have done it. American exceptionalism, there's your exceptionalism, or at least part of it. That's kind of strange. Right? So, okay, well, we're going to be expanding on this next week and looking in particular at the famous or notorious Scopes monkey trial of 1925. Where you think of it as famous or notorious, one thing's for sure, it was certainly a watershed. So, we're going to be looking at that one big event in depth next week. Do stay with us, people, and thank you for being with us for this one.
Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you next week.
Bye bye now.